In the year 332 before Christ, Alexander of Macedon stood on the Lebanese shore and stared across 600 meters of open water at a city that refused to kneel. No army in the ancient world had ever breached those island walls. Shalmaneser had tried for 5 years and failed. Nebuchadnezzar had camped on the mainland for 13 years and never set foot inside. So Alexander did what no conqueror before him had imagined. He erased the sea itself, building a causeway stone by stone until the island became a peninsula forever. How did a rocky outcrop, barely 135 acres in size, become the most unconquerable, most envied, most imitated city in the ancient Mediterranean? And what was lost the day its waters were filled with rubble? This is the complete story of Tyre. Not a single chapter, not a glimpse of one era, but the full arc of an extraordinary urban life spanning nearly 3,000 years. We begin with the geological accident that made this place inevitable, a rocky island blessed with twin natural harbours and freshwater springs rising from the seabed, positioned at the exact crossroads where Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Aegean, and Western Mediterranean trade routes converged. We trace the earliest settlers at mainland Ushu in the 3rd millennium before Christ, and the moment the island itself drew permanent habitation. We follow Tyre through its Bronze Age youth under the shadow of Pharaoh, when King Abimilki wrote desperate letters on clay tablets begging Egypt for help. We witness the Golden Age under Hiram I, when the island was physically enlarged with landfill, when cedar and gold adorned the temple of Melkart, and when Tyrian ships carried bronze pillars to Solomon's Jerusalem. We walk the impossibly crowded streets where 30,000 people lived in multi-story stone towers on an island smaller than most modern neighborhoods, breathing air thick with the stench of crushed murex snails, the source of the purple dye that made kings beg for Tyrian cloth. We sail with Tyrian captains to Carthage, to Gades beyond the Pillars of Heracles, to dozens of colonies that seeded urban civilization across the Western Sea. We endure the sieges, Assyrian and Babylonian, that battered the walls for years and never broke them. We stand on those walls the morning Alexander's causeway finally reached the southern rampart, and we witness the catastrophe that followed. 8,000 dead, 30,000 enslaved, and an island transformed into a peninsula that remains joined to the mainland to this day. We watch Tyre rise again under Greek and Roman masters, its colonnaded streets and vast hippodrome testifying to resilience even after the Phoenician soul had been broken. And we follow the archaeologists, from Ernest Renan in 1860 to the modern campaigns still struggling to reach the Bronze Age layers buried beneath a living city. What makes Tyre irreplaceable is not merely its wealth or its walls. This is the city that transmitted the alphabet, those 22 Phoenician letters that became Greek, that became Latin, that became the script you read today. This is the city whose colonial network planted urban life from North Africa to the Atlantic coast of Spain. This is the city that proved a maritime trading state could rival land empires, that commercial genius could outlast military force for century after century. Without Tyre, there is no Carthage. Without Tyre, the Western Mediterranean remains unwritten for generations longer. Every letter carved on every Roman monument traces its ancestry back to marks first scratched by Phoenician hands on this island. And yet, the deepest layers of Tyre remain locked beneath modern streets, tantalizingly close but unreachable. The temples Hiram built, the harbours that launched 1,000 colonial voyages, the workshops where artisans extracted purple from 12,000 snails to produce a single gram of dye, all of it still waits in the dark beneath inhabited ground. What the archaeologists have found is magnificent. What remains hidden may rewrite everything we think we know. If you find yourself drawn to complete journeys through the great cities of the ancient world, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week, we bring back to life a world built in ashlar stone, cedar beams, and bronze. Now let us begin where every story of Tyre must begin, with the sea, the rock, and the choice to build a city on water. Long before any hand laid stone upon stone, the sea had already chosen this place. Off the coast of what is now southern Lebanon, a low rocky platform rises from the Mediterranean floor, its surface barely climbing above the waterline. It sits roughly 600 meters from the mainland shore, close enough to see cooking fires on the beach, far enough to make any attacker pause. The island measures perhaps 135 acres at its widest natural extent, a rough oblong of limestone and sandstone, scoured by salt wind, baked white under the Levantine sun. What makes this rock extraordinary is not its size, it is the water beneath it. Freshwater springs rise from the seabed around the island's margins, pushing up through fissures in the submarine limestone, cold and sweet against the surrounding brine. Sailors in antiquity could lower jars into the sea at certain points and draw up drinkable water. This geological accident, fresh water accessible without wells, without dependence on the mainland, transformed a barren reef into a place where human life could root itself and hold. Then there are the harbours. The island's irregular coastline creates two natural anchorages, one opening north, sheltered from the prevailing southwesterly winds, and one opening south, protected when winter storms blow from the north. A vessel fleeing weather from any quarter could find calm water on one side or the other. In an age when ships were beached each night and a single storm could destroy a trading fleet, twin harbours represented survival itself. The mainland opposite the island held its own logic. The coastal tell known as Ushu accumulated settlement layers from the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era onward. Pottery fragments from this period, simple utilitarian ware, storage jars, cooking vessels, mark the presence of a fishing and farming community exploiting the narrow, fertile plain between the Lebanese mountain range and the sea. The coastal corridor running from Egypt northward to Byblos and Ugarit passed directly through this stretch of shore. Ushu sat on the road. The island sat on the sea. Together they commanded both. By the 19th century before the Common Era, Egyptian scribes inscribed the name of Tyre onto ceramic vessels and figurines intended for ritual cursing, the so-called execration texts, designed to bind the power of foreign cities that Egypt considered threats or rivals. The very act of naming Tyre in these texts reveals that the island settlement had already grown significant enough to register in pharaonic consciousness. It was no longer a fisherman's refuge. It was a place with walls, with a name that carried weight across the waters to the Nile Delta. The earliest archaeological layers beneath the modern city remain largely inaccessible, buried under centuries of continuous habitation. But what fragments have emerged? 3rd millennium ceramics, Traces of early Bronze Age construction confirm what the geography always promised. The springs gave water, the harbours gave shelter. The sea gave distance from enemies and access to the world. A rock in the water, barely rising above the waves, held within its limestone bones the seed of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. The logic was written in salt and stone long before any king claimed it, long before any temple rose above its shore. The sea chose this place. Then humanity arrived and understood why. By the 18th century before the Common Era, Egypt's pharaohs already knew the name. Carved into clay figurines meant to curse rebellious vassals, the execration texts had marked Tyre as a place worth watching, a port whose loyalty mattered, whose defiance carried consequence. Now, as the Middle Bronze Age deepened, the island entered the orbit of the Nile with a gravity that would hold for half a millennium. Egyptian trade goods begin appearing in the coastal Levant in abundance during this period. Scarabs, faience amulets, alabaster vessels. The harbours of Tyre received cedar from the mountains behind Byblos, copper from Cyprus, and in return sent south the luxuries that pharaonic courts demanded. Tyre was not yet the greatest of the coastal cities. Byblos held older prestige, Ugarit commanded the northern routes. But the island possessed what no mainland port could offer: security without siege walls, anchorage without vulnerability. Ships could shelter in the northern harbour when winter storms drove from the west, or in the southern basin when gales swept down from Anatolia. The island needed no army to defend its approaches, only vigilance and the sea. Through the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era, as Egypt's new kingdom extended direct imperial control over the Levantine coast, Tyre became a node in the pharaonic administrative network. Egyptian garrison towns dotted the mainland. Tribute flowed south, and the kings of Tyre wrote to their overlord in Akkadian cuneiform on small clay tablets, pressing their loyalty into wet earth. The Amarna letters, discovered in 1887 in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, preserve 10 such missives from Abimilki, king of Tyre, addressed to the pharaoh he calls his sun-god and lord. The letters, numbered 146 through 155 in the archive, reveal a city under pressure. Abimilki writes that he has no fresh water, no wood, no means to bury his dead. The king of Sidon has turned hostile. The mainland town of Ushu, Tyre's agricultural hinterland, has been seized by enemies. He begs for Egyptian archers, for grain, for any sign that the distant pharaoh remembers his faithful servant on the rock. What emerges from these desperate tablets is the portrait of a city whose island strength was also its constraint. Tyre could not be taken, but it could be starved. Its population depended on the mainland for timber, for farmland, for cemetery space. The harbour brought wealth from afar, but bread came from the fields of Ushu, visible across the narrow strait. When those fields fell to hostile hands, the island tightened like a fist around its own hunger. Yet Tyre endured. The late Bronze Age system, that intricate web of palace economies linking Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, Cyprus, and the Aegean, sustained the island's commerce for 2 more centuries. Tyrian ships carried Egyptian grain north and Cypriot copper south. The temples on the island, though their precise Bronze Age form remains unexcavated, likely already honored the god who would become Melkart, the divine king of the city, lord of the sea. Then, around 1200 before the Common Era, the world burned. Ugarit fell and never rose again. Hattusa was abandoned. Mycenaean palaces collapsed. Egyptian power withdrew behind the delta. The Sea Peoples, whatever coalition of displaced populations that name conceals, swept the Levantine coast. City after city shows a destruction layer from this horizon. Ash, collapsed mud brick, abandoned streets. But not Tyre. The island held. Whether through negotiation, naval defense, or simply the impassable moat of the sea, the rock survived the Bronze Age collapse intact. The cities that had overshadowed it, Ugarit, Byblos in its old grandeur, were gone or diminished. When the smoke cleared and the 12th century settled into its impoverished silence, Tyre remained. Its harbours still functioned. Its people still lived on the crowded rock. And in the vacuum left by the collapse of every great power that had once constrained it, the island city stood poised at the threshold of an age it would dominate, free, unburned, and facing the open sea. The silence that followed the collapse did not last long. Within 2 generations, the vacuum of power across the eastern Mediterranean began to fill, and Tyre filled it. By the 10th century before the Common Era, the island city had emerged from the wreckage of the Bronze Age not merely intact, but ascendant, and the king who would transform it from a crowded maritime outpost into the capital of the Phoenician world was Hiram, first of that name, who reigned from roughly 969 to 936 before the Common Era. What Hiram inherited was a rock. What he built was a metropolis. The ancient sources, preserved through Josephus citing the lost Phoenician historian Menander of Ephesus, describe a building program of extraordinary ambition. Hiram looked at the island's 135 acres and saw them as insufficient. He ordered landfill driven into the shallows between the main island and a smaller rocky outcrop to the east, physically enlarging the landmass of Tyre. Rubble, stone, and earth were dumped into the sea, compacted, and built upon. The city grew outward from its own shoreline, gaining ground from the water that had always protected it. On this expanded platform, Hiram raised the great temple of Melkart, lord of the city, god of the sea, divine patron of Tyrian commerce and colonization. The old sanctuary was demolished and rebuilt with cedar beams hauled from the mountains of Lebanon and columns sheathed in gold. Menander records that Hiram also rebuilt the temple of Astarte and laid out new sacred precincts with courtyards open to the salt wind. The smell of incense and burnt offerings mingled with harbour tar and the ever-present reek of murex processing from the workshops along the southern shore. The harbours themselves were reshaped. The northern harbour, called the Sidonian port, faced the trade routes running up the coast toward Byblos and beyond. The southern harbour, the Egyptian port, opened toward the sea lanes leading to the Nile Delta and the Red Sea. Both were deepened, their quays extended with ashlar masonry, the precisely cut limestone blocks that became a signature of Phoenician construction. Ships could now load and unload in greater numbers, and the twin harbour system gave Tyre an advantage no mainland port could match: shelter from storms regardless of wind direction. It was this infrastructure that made possible the most famous alliance of Hiram's reign. The Hebrew Scriptures and Josephus both record that Hiram entered a commercial partnership with Solomon of Israel. Cedar and cypress timber flowed south from Lebanon. Tyrian craftsmen, bronze casters, stone cutters, woodworkers, traveled to Jerusalem to build Solomon's temple. A master metalworker, also named Hiram, cast the great bronze pillars and the molten sea for the temple courtyard. In return, Solomon provided wheat and olive oil, and the two kings jointly operated a fleet from the Red Sea port of Etzion-Geber, trading southward for gold, ivory, and rare woods. The wealth that poured back into Tyre from these ventures transformed the island. Multi-story stone buildings rose 4 and 5 levels high, their flat roofs lined with plastered cisterns to catch winter rain. Streets narrowed to shoulder width between these towers. The population pressed toward 30,000 souls on an area smaller than many modern neighborhoods. Every surface was used. Every rooftop served as workspace, sleeping platform, or water catchment. Hiram's Tyre was not merely a city. It was a proof of concept that an island smaller than a modest farm could command the trade of the known world through engineering, seamanship, and the calculated projection of divine authority through the cult of Melkart. The temple's golden columns caught the morning sun and were visible from the sea, a beacon for returning ships and a statement to every foreign vessel approaching the harbour. This rock belonged to a god, and that god's city was open for business. The foundations Hiram laid, in stone, in commerce, in sacred architecture, would carry Tyre's name across every shore the Mediterranean touched. The wealth that flowed through Tyre's harbours was not abstract. It had colour, weight, and smell. Above all, it had smell. South of the island, along the mainland shore and on exposed coastal rocks, the dye works operated in open air, and the stench carried for miles. Ancient writers noted it with disgust. The reek of rotting flesh, of organic decay concentrated in stone vats under the Mediterranean sun, announced Tyre's most precious industry, long before the city's walls came into view. 2 species of predatory sea snail made this possible. Bolinus brandaris, with its long spiked shell, and Hexaplex trunculus, rounder and ridged, each carried within its body a tiny hyperbranchial gland containing mere drops of pale mucus. Exposed to sunlight, this secretion transformed through chemical reaction into a dye of extraordinary permanence. A violet so deep it appeared almost black in folds of cloth, shifting to rich purple where light struck the fibers directly. The color did not fade with washing. It did not bleach in sun. It grew richer with age. No other ancient dye possessed these qualities, and no other city mastered the production at Tyre's scale. The mathematics of extraction were staggering. Approximately 12,000 snails yielded barely 1.5 grams of usable dye, enough to color only the trim of a single garment. Archaeological deposits south of Sidon and along Tyre's own coastline reveal murex shell middens meters deep, stretching across hundreds of square meters. Millions upon millions of creatures were harvested, cracked open, their glands extracted by hand, the mucus collected in stone basins where it was mixed with salt, left to soak for 3 days, then slowly heated in water, never boiled for 10 days more. Workers stirred the vats. The liquid reduced. The smell intensified beyond endurance. At the end, a concentrate remained that could fix permanently into wool or linen fibers, producing the color that would define royalty across the ancient world. Cedar was Tyre's second great commodity. The forests of Mount Lebanon, rising behind the coastal plain, provided timber unmatched in the ancient Near East, straight-grained, aromatic, resistant to rot and insects, capable of spanning temple halls and palace roofs that no other available wood could bridge. Tyrian merchants controlled the coastal transport of these logs, floated south along the shoreline in rafted bundles, delivered to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and every palace-building king who could afford the price. Alongside these dominant trades, Tyre's workshops produced goods of extraordinary refinement. Glassmakers heated silica sand with plant ash and mineral colorants, drawing molten threads around clay cores to form small vessels of blue, yellow, and white. Perfume flasks and cosmetic containers traded across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Ivory carvers worked hippopotamus teeth and elephant tusks imported from Egypt and Nubia, producing furniture inlays, cosmetic boxes, and decorative plaques found in Assyrian palaces and Israelite royal buildings alike. Metalworkers cast bronze vessels, fashioned gold jewelry, and produced the fittings for the merchant fleet that carried all these goods outward. The island's economy was thus a machine of transformation. Raw materials arrived: murex from the sea, cedar from the mountains, metals from Cyprus and Anatolia, ivory from Africa, and departed as finished luxury goods worth many times their weight in grain or silver. Every cramped workshop on those 135 acres added value. Every stinking dye vat along the shore converted biological waste into the most expensive substance in the textile world. The purple-stained hands of Tyre's workers, slaves and free laborers alike, produced the color that Assyrian kings demanded for their robes, that Egyptian priests wrapped around sacred images, that Greek aristocrats would later covet as the mark of supreme status. The smell was the price, the color was the reward, and the prophets built the fleets that would carry Tyre's name to the far western edge of the known sea. Those fleets sailed west. They sailed beyond the horizon of any chart, beyond the last Egyptian lighthouse, beyond the waters where Greek fishermen dared to venture. They sailed into open sea with nothing but star knowledge, coastal memory, and the deep institutional confidence of a city that had been building ships for 1,000 years. The vessels that departed Tyre's southern harbor, broad-beamed merchant galleys with high curved sterns and ram-reinforced prows, carried more than purple cloth and cedar oil. They carried the idea of Tyre itself, its gods, its alphabet, its urban model, its commercial logic. And wherever they made landfall, they planted that idea in foreign soil. The pattern began close to home. Kition on Cyprus, barely a day's sail from the Lebanese coast, received Tyrian settlers who rebuilt its temple to match Melkart's sanctuary back on the island. Copper from Cypriot mines flowed east. Finished goods and religious authority flowed west. But Cyprus was merely the first step. The true reach of Tyre's colonial ambition stretched across the entire Mediterranean basin, from the Strait of Gibraltar to the coasts of North Africa, from Sardinia's mineral-rich interior to the silver rivers of southern Iberia. The founding of Gades, modern Cadiz, placed Tyrian merchants beyond the Pillars of Heracles at the edge of the Atlantic. Ancient tradition dated this settlement to around 1100 before the Common Era, making it among the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. Archaeological evidence confirms Phoenician presence there by the 8th century. The purpose was clear: access to Atlantic tin and Iberian silver, metals that the Bronze Age had craved and the Iron Age still demanded. Along the North African coast, Tyrian ships established Utica and Leptis, way stations and trading posts that hugged the shoreline between Egypt and the far west. But the greatest of all Tyrian foundations was Carthage. Ancient sources preserved the story of Alyssa, called Dido by Latin writers, a Tyrian princess who fled political murder and sailed west with a company of nobles and temple attendants around 814 before the Common Era. Whether the founding legend preserves historical memory or literary invention, archaeology confirms that Carthage's earliest occupation layers date to the 8th century, with pottery, religious iconography, and urban planning unmistakably Tyrian in character. The Topet Sanctuary, where Carthaginians made offerings to Tanit and Baal-Hamon, echoed ritual traditions rooted in Tyre's own sacred precincts. On Sardinia, the Nora stone, one of the oldest Phoenician inscriptions found in the western Mediterranean, testifies to Tyrian presence by the 9th or 8th century. Its weathered letters, carved in the same consonantal script that Tyrian scribes used for commercial records and temple dedications, represent something larger than one settlement. They represent the transmission of literacy itself. Every colony that received Tyrian merchants also received the Phoenician alphabet, 22 signs, elegant in their economy, adaptable to any language. The Greeks borrowed and modified these letters. From Greek they passed to Etruscan, then Latin. The script now reading these words descends in unbroken lineage from marks first standardized in Phoenician cities like Tyre. Navigation made all of this possible. Tyrian sailors used the constellation later Greeks would call the Little Bear, Ursa Minor, to hold course through open water at night. They understood prevailing wind patterns, seasonal current shifts, and the telltale color changes of water depth near unseen shoals. Their ships, built from Lebanese cedar planking, joined with mortise and tenon joinery and sealed with pitch, could carry perhaps 400 amphorae of cargo across weeks of open sea. By the 8th century before the Common Era, Tyre presided over a network stretching nearly 4,000 kilometers from east to west. It was not an empire of armies and governors. It was an empire of harbours, temples, and shared script, held together by kinship, by the worship of Melkart, whose sacred fire burned in every colonial sanctuary, and by the relentless commercial logic of a city too small to feed itself, too ambitious to accept any horizon as final. That empire of harbours now faced an empire of iron. From the plains of Mesopotamia, the Assyrian war machine turned its gaze toward the Mediterranean coast, and the wealth that moved through Phoenician ports became a prize no great king could ignore. Tiglath-Pileser III swept through the Levant in the 730s before the Common Era, reducing Sidon, Byblos, and the mainland districts of Tyre to tributary status. The island paid. Gold, purple cloth, carved ivory, the tribute lists inscribed on Assyrian palace walls at Nimrud enumerate the cost of survival. But paying tribute and surrendering sovereignty were different things, and Tyre understood the distinction with a clarity born of geography. 600 meters of open water still separated the island from any army that marched on foot. When Shalmaneser V attempted to enforce deeper submission around 727 before the Common Era, Tyre refused. The Assyrian king assembled a fleet, reportedly 60 Phoenician vessels conscripted from Sidon and other coastal cities, to blockade the island. Tyre met them with 12 warships. According to Josephus, drawing on the lost chronicles of Menander of Ephesus, the Tyrian squadron scattered the larger fleet and captured 500 prisoners. The blockade settled into a siege of attrition that lasted 5 years, Assyrian forces held the mainland, cutting off the freshwater conduits from Ushu. The islanders dug cisterns, collected rain on every rooftop, and endured. The walls held. Shalmaneser died. Tyre survived. Sennacherib returned to the coast around 701 before the Common Era. His palace reliefs at Nineveh depict Phoenician-style ships with high prows and double banks of oars, vessels built by the very people he sought to subdue. King Luli of Tyre fled by sea to Cyprus rather than face the siege. Sennacherib installed a puppet ruler and extracted tribute, but the island itself remained unbreached. Esarhaddon pressed harder in the 670s, imposing a treaty that restricted Tyrian trade routes and demanded loyalty oaths. The terms survive in cuneiform, a document revealing how desperately Assyria wanted control of Tyre's commercial networks and how stubbornly the city negotiated even under duress. Then came Babylon. After Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era, he turned his army south along the coast and laid siege to Tyre. This was no brief campaign. 13 years the Babylonian forces camped on the mainland shore, from 586 to 573. 13 years of watching the island across that narrow strait, unable to cross. Nebuchadnezzar had no fleet capable of challenging Tyrian naval power. The island received grain from Carthage, water from its cisterns and submarine springs, and supplies from sympathetic ports beyond Babylonian reach. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from exile in Babylon during these very years, pronounced Tyre's doom in chapters 26 through 28, a city of perfect beauty, a merchant of peoples on many coastlands, destined to sink beneath the waves. The prophecy burned with the fury of a world that could not bring this island to its knees. When the siege finally ended, Tyre submitted to Babylonian authority, accepting a vassal king, but the walls had never been breached. No Babylonian soldier had set foot on the island by force. The city's defenses, massive ashlar blocks fitted without mortar, rising sheer from the waterline on every side, had proven impervious to any power that lacked naval supremacy. The cost was real. Mainland Ushu lay devastated. Trade routes had been disrupted for over a decade. The colonial network in the west, increasingly autonomous, drifted further from the mother city's direct control. Carthage, once a daughter, was becoming a rival. Yet the island endured, its harbours battered but functional, its temples still standing, the sacred fire of Melkart still burning in its precinct above the southern port. When Persian forces under Cyrus absorbed the Babylonian Empire in 539 before the Common Era, they found Tyre diminished but unbroken, an island that had outlasted every siege engine, every blockade, every army that had stood on the shore and stared across that impossible strip of water. To stand on the island at the height of its power, sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era, is to stand in one of the most densely inhabited places the ancient world ever produced. 135 acres of rock, entirely built over, rising not outward but upward. Stone buildings climb 4 and 5 stories, their flat roofs crowded with clay cisterns that catch winter rain, with drying racks for fish and flax, with sleeping mats laid out under summer stars when the lower floors become unbearable with heat. The streets between these towers are narrow enough that neighbours on upper floors might pass objects hand to hand across the gap. Light reaches the ground level only at midday, and even then as a thin blade. Between 25,000 and 40,000 people inhabit this space. The density surpasses anything in the contemporary Greek or Mesopotamian world. Every surface serves a purpose. Ground floors are workshops and storage. Upper floors are living quarters, subdivided and subdivided again as families grow. The rooftops are a second city, a world of water collection, food preparation, and nighttime relief from the press of bodies below. Water arrives by two means. Submarine freshwater springs rise from the seabed near the island's southern shore, channeled through submerged conduits into collection basins. A mainland aqueduct, running from springs at Ras El Ain across the coastal plain, feeds additional reservoirs through a system whose exact crossing mechanism, whether by boat-borne skins or shallow underwater pipe, remains debated. The rooftop cisterns supplement both sources, plastered inside to prevent seepage, their capacity calculated against the long, dry summers. The twin harbours define the city's rhythm. The northern port, called the Sidonian harbour, faces the open sea toward Byblos and the Aegean trade. The southern port, the Egyptian harbour, opens toward the routes to the Nile Delta and beyond. Both are enclosed by constructed moles and seawalls, their quays lined with warehouses. At dawn the harbours fill with noise, the creak of mooring ropes, the shouts of stevedores, the thud of amphorae being stacked. Goods from 3 continents pass across these stones: Egyptian grain and faience, Greek painted pottery, Cypriot copper, Arabian incense, Mesopotamian cylinder seals and textiles, Spanish silver, African ivory. The markets occupy every open space between harbour and temple. Merchants trade by weight and barter, using standardized stone weights shaped like crouching animals. The smell of the marketplace is cedar resin, dried fish, spilled wine, and always, faintly, the acrid rot of murex carried on the southern wind from the dye works. Above the commercial din rise the temple precincts. The sanctuary of Melkart dominates the southern quarter, its gold-sheathed columns visible from the sea, its sacred fire tended perpetually by shaven-headed priests. Each spring, the Egasus festival celebrates the god's resurrection, his awakening from death by fire. The ritual involves the burning of an effigy and the proclamation of the god's return, drawing pilgrims from colonies across the Mediterranean. Nearby, the temple of Astarte receives offerings of incense, terracotta figurines, and small bronze statuettes. Sacrificial altars in open courtyards bear the residue of burnt animal offerings, sheep, goats, doves, their smoke rising above the roofline to mingle with the salt air. The dead cannot remain on the island. Space forbids it. Burials take place on the mainland at Ushu, in rock-cut tombs and cremation urns, the ashes sometimes placed in Phoenician-style anthropoid sarcophagi of baked clay. Funeral processions cross the harbour by boat, a brief voyage between the world of the living and the world of the dead. At night, oil lamps flicker in thousands of windows. The island glows faintly against the dark sea. From a distance, a sailor approaching would see this constellation of small fires hovering above the water. A city that seems to float, impossibly full, impossibly alive, burning with the energy of a civilization that has compressed an empire's ambition onto a single rock. When Cyrus the Great's armies swept through Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, the ancient world shifted on its axis. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that had besieged Tyre for 13 grinding years simply ceased to exist. And Tyre, That stubborn island which Nebuchadnezzar had never breached now faced a new calculation. The Persians did not come with siege towers. They came with an offer: submission without destruction, autonomy in exchange for loyalty. The Achaemenid system demanded tribute, military service, and acknowledgement of the great king's sovereignty, but it permitted local kings to rule, local gods to be worshipped, local commerce to flourish. For Tyre, exhausted by decades of Babylonian pressure, this was not conquest. It was liberation dressed in imperial purple. The island's harbours, which had survived every blockade, now became the cornerstone of Persian naval power in the western Mediterranean. Tyre provided the finest warships in the Achaemenid fleet, triremes built from Lebanese cedar, their rams sheathed in bronze, their crews drawn from generations of deep-water sailors. When Cambyses marched against Egypt in 525 before the Common Era, Tyrian galleys carried his supply lines along the coast. When Darius faced rebellion, Tyrian ships enforced order across the Eastern Sea. The supreme test came in 480 before the Common Era. Xerxes assembled the largest naval force the ancient world had ever seen for his invasion of Greece. Herodotus records the Phoenician contingent, and Tyre's squadron in particular, as the finest ships in the fleet. At Salamis, in the narrow strait between Attica and the island, those Tyrian warships fought against Athenian triremes. The Persians lost that day, but Tyre's reputation as a naval power only deepened. The great king needed this island more than the island needed him. Under Persian suzerainty, Tyre's commerce expanded rather than contracted. The Achaemenid peace, stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, opened overland routes that fed directly into Tyrian harbours. Goods from Persepolis, from the Afghan highlands, from the markets of Susa, flowed westward and found Tyrian ships waiting to carry them onward. The purple dye workshops continued their reeking labour. The cedar trade persisted. The colonial network, though Carthage had long since grown independent, still connected Tyre to markets in Cyprus, Sicily, and the western shores. Around 450 before the Common Era, Tyre began minting its own silver coinage, a privilege that signaled the city's exceptional status within the empire. These shekels bear extraordinary images. Melkart, the city's divine patron, riding a winged hippocampus over stylized waves, a dolphin swimming beneath. On the reverse, an owl with crook and flail, Egyptian symbols absorbed into Phoenician iconography. These coins circulated across the Levant for centuries, their silver content so reliable that they became the standard currency for temple transactions far beyond Tyre's own walls. The city itself remained dense, vertical, thrumming with maritime energy. Persian period harbour installations reinforced the ancient quays. The twin ports, the Sidonian harbour facing north, the Egyptian harbour facing south, handled traffic from every direction. Warehouses stored grain from the Bekaa Valley, wine from the Phoenician hinterland, incense from Arabia. The island's population held steady at tens of thousands, compressed into those same 135 acres, still drawing fresh water from the submarine springs and the mainland aqueduct. Local kings ruled under Persian oversight. They attended the great king's councils, contributed ships on demand, and maintained the ancient rites of Melkart in his temple of cedar and gold. The Agassiz festival still marked the god's annual resurrection each spring. Priests still kindled the sacred fire. The city functioned as it always had, a sovereign organism within a larger imperial body, trading obedience for the freedom to trade. For 2 centuries, this arrangement held. Tyre prospered under the Persian umbrella without losing its essential character. But empires rise and empires fall, and by the 330s before the Common Era, a young Macedonian king was dismantling the Achaemenid world city by city, battle by battle, moving inexorably south along the Phoenician coast. The fleet that had fought for the great king would soon face a conqueror who did not offer terms. He arrived in January of 332 before the Common Era, fresh from the surrender of Sidon, his army stretching along the coastal road like a bronze-scaled serpent. Alexander of Macedon sent envoys to the island. He wished to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom the Greeks called Heracles, ancestor of his royal line. The Tyrians understood immediately. To admit a foreign king with his army into their sacred precinct was to admit a conqueror. They refused. They offered compromise, sacrifice at the old temple of Melkart on the mainland, at Ushu. Alexander would not be deflected. The island had defied Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years. It would now defy the man who had broken the Persian Empire at Issus. The channel between mainland and island stretched roughly 600 meters. The water was shallow near shore, barely a man's depth for the first 200 meters, but deepened to nearly 6 meters closer to the island walls. Alexander ordered what no commander before him had attempted. He would fill the sea itself. His engineers began demolishing old Tyre on the mainland, the ancient settlement of Ushu, its mud brick houses, its stone foundations, its very streets, and hauling the rubble into the water. Cedar logs from the Lebanon range were driven as pilings. Stone upon stone, the causeway crept seaward. Arrian records that the work progressed easily at first, in the shallows, where men waded and dumped fill-in calm water. But as the mole extended into deeper channel, the Tyrian fleet struck. War galleys surged from the northern and southern harbours. Archers raked the labourers from the decks. Then came the fire ship, a converted horse transport, its hull packed with pitch, sulphur, dry brush, and cauldrons of oil, its yardarms hung with additional combustibles. The Tyrians ran it directly into the siege towers Alexander had erected at the mole's advancing head. The towers burned. The mole's wooden facing caught fire. Tyrian swimmers dove beneath the surface and pulled away the protective stakes. Weeks of construction were undone in hours. Alexander adapted. He ordered the mole widened to approximately 60 meters, broad enough for multiple towers beyond the reach of a single fire ship. He requisitioned fleets from Sidon, Byblos, Arados, and Cyprus, cities that had submitted and now contributed over 200 warships. With this armada he blockaded both Tyrian harbours, neutralizing the island's greatest advantage, its command of the surrounding sea. The Tyrians were sealed inside their own walls for the first time in their history. The siege ground forward through spring and summer. Siege engines were mounted on barges lashed together, their rams battering the island's seaward fortifications. The Tyrians dropped boulders into the water to prevent approach. Divers cut the anchor cables of Macedonian ships. The defenders heated sand in bronze shields and poured it over the walls onto attackers below, the grains slipping beneath armor, burning flesh. They stretched hides and seaweed curtains to absorb catapult stones. Every innovation met counter-innovation. The island fought with the desperation of a city that had never fallen to assault. In July, the breach came. Macedonian rams, working from barges against the southern wall where the fortification curved and the stone was weakest, opened a gap. Alexander himself led the assault force across gangplanks laid from ship decks to the broken wall. Hypaspists poured through. Simultaneously, forces from the completed causeway pressed the eastern defences. The Tyrians fell back toward the Melkart Temple and the northern harbour. There was no quarter. Arrian and Diodorus record 8,000 Tyrians killed in the fighting and immediate aftermath. 30,000, women, children, the elderly foreign residents, were sold into slavery. Only those who had taken refuge in the Temple of Melkart were spared. The city that had resisted every siege in its long history was broken in 7 months by a 24-year-old king who refused the sea as a barrier. But the deepest consequence was geological, not human. The causeway remained. Sediment accumulated against its flanks, year after year, century after century. The channel filled. The island ceased to be an island. What storms and tides had separated for millennia, Alexander's engineers joined permanently. The rocky fortress that had drawn its power from isolation became a peninsula, and remains one to this day, its outline still visible from space, a scar of conquest written into the coastline itself. The peninsula that Alexander left behind was not a ruin for long. Within a generation of the sack, new settlers moved among the rubble. Macedonian veterans, returning Tyrian refugees, and merchants drawn by the harbour's undying logic began laying fresh foundations atop the shattered Phoenician walls. The twin harbours still functioned. The submarine springs still rose. The geographic advantage that had made Tyre great could not be erased by a single catastrophe. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, which controlled the Levantine coast for much of the 3rd century before the Common Era, Tyre regained its commercial pulse. Egyptian grain flowed through its southern harbour. Ptolemaic administrators imposed order, but they also recognized what Tyre had always been, a city that generated wealth through exchange. The dye workshops resumed production. Murex shells accumulated once more in the middens south of the city. Purple cloth, that ancient signature of Tyrian mastery, again moved westward on merchant vessels. The urban fabric changed. Hellenistic planning principles, wider streets intersecting at right angles, a central agora, standardized building lots, overlaid the cramped Phoenician labyrinth. Yet the old sacred geography persisted beneath the grid. The Temple of Melkart, rebuilt after the sack, now bore Greek architectural vocabulary, Corinthian capitals, marble entablatures, but the god within remained recognizably Phoenician. Greek visitors called him Heracles, noting the annual Agersis festival in which the god was awakened from death, a ritual older than any Greek myth of the hero. The syncretism was genuine. Melkart wore a lion skin now, carried a club in sculptural representations, yet the sacred fire still burned in his sanctuary according to ancient Tyrian rite. When Seleucid power replaced Ptolemaic control around 198 before the Common Era, Tyre adapted again. The city navigated between rival Hellenistic kingdoms with the same diplomatic cunning it had once deployed against Assyria and Babylon. Seleucid kings granted privileges, confirmed harbour rights, and extracted naval service in return. Tyre's fleet, rebuilt in Hellenistic style with larger warships, served successive monarchs while the city's merchants pursued their own interests across the eastern Mediterranean. The decisive moment came in 126 before the Common Era. As Seleucid authority fragmented, Tyre seized autonomy. The city began minting its own silver coinage, the famous Tyrian shekel. These coins bore the head of Melkart Heracles on the obverse and an eagle perched on a ship's prow on the reverse, with the inscription declaring Tyre holy and inviolable. The silver was remarkably pure, consistently over 94% fine, making the Tyrian shekel the most trusted currency in the Levant. Its reputation spread so far that the temple in Jerusalem accepted only Tyrian shekels for the annual half-shekel tax, a Phoenician coin paying for Jewish sacred obligations, commerce and faith intertwined across cultural boundaries. The peninsula grew. Sediment continued accumulating against Alexander's causeway, widening the land bridge decade by decade. New construction spread across ground that had been open water a century before. The city's footprint expanded beyond the old island's 135 acres for the first time in its history. Warehouses, workshops, and residential quarters colonized the growing spit of land. The harbor basins required periodic dredging to remain functional, but Tyre's engineers managed the shifting coastline as they had always managed the sea, with patience, skill, and relentless pragmatism. By the time Roman legions arrived under Pompey in 64 before the Common Era, absorbing the remnants of the Seleucid state, Tyre was once again a thriving metropolis. It was no longer an island. It was no longer independent in the old Phoenician sense. Its alphabet had become Greek letters, its god wore a Greek face, its streets followed Greek geometry. Yet the purple still stained the workers' hands. The harbours still sheltered ships from every wind. The springs still rose through salt water. Beneath the Hellenistic pavement, Phoenician ashlar foundations carried the weight of the new city as they had carried the old, silently, immovably, remembering everything. Rome brought order, and order brought stone. Under Pompey's settlement of the East, Tyre received the status of a free city, permitted to govern its own affairs, mint its own coinage, and maintain its ancient festivals. The Tyrian shekel continued to circulate. The temple authorities in Jerusalem still demanded it for the annual tax, trusting its silver purity above all other currencies in the Levant. But now the city answered to Rome, and Rome's architectural language began to reshape the peninsula that Alexander's causeway had created 2.5 centuries before. The transformation was gradual at first, then overwhelming. A monumental colonnaded street cut through the city's heart, running roughly north to south along the spine of the former island. Granite columns, imported, massive, polished to a grey sheen, rose on either side, supporting covered porticos that sheltered merchants, lawyers, and idlers from the Mediterranean sun. The street's paving stones, broad and fitted with precision, bore the ruts of centuries of cart traffic. At its northern terminus stood a triumphal arch, its stones carved with imperial dedications, framing the view of the harbour beyond. But the most extraordinary monument lay to the southeast, on the mainland portion of the peninsula, where Alexander's mole had accumulated centuries of sediment. Here the Romans built a hippodrome nearly 480 meters long, one of the largest in the entire Eastern Empire. Its seating rose in tiers of cut limestone, accommodating perhaps 30,000 spectators. The central spina divided the racing track, adorned with columns, turning posts of gilded bronze and small shrines. On race days, the thunder of hooves and the roar of the crowd carried across the water to fishing boats offshore. When Septimius Severus granted Tyre the rank of colonia around 198 of the Common Era, it was recognition of a city already magnificent. Tyre's law schools had produced Domitius Ulpianus, Ulpian, born around 170, whose legal writings would form nearly a third of Justinian's Digest centuries later. The city that once exported purple dye and cedar now exported jurisprudence. Water flowed to the peninsula through a Roman aqueduct originating at Ras El Ain, several kilometers to the south, its arched spans crossing the coastal plain to feed public fountains, bathhouses, and the private cisterns of wealthy homes. Mosaic floors adorned dining rooms, geometric patterns in black and white, or elaborate polychrome scenes of Dionysus, marine creatures, and the seasons. The old Phoenician density persisted, but now dressed in Roman marble veneer. South of the Hippodrome, the dead received their own city. The necropolis of Roman Tyre extended along the ancient road, hundreds of sarcophagi arranged in orderly rows, some of local limestone, others of imported Proconesian marble carved with scenes from Greek mythology. Achilles among the daughters of Lycomedes, the drunken procession of Dionysus, garlands held by Erotes. The lids bore reclining figures, eyes open, gazing into eternity with the calm of those who expected the afterlife to resemble a banquet. Some sarcophagi stood within elaborate funerary chambers, their walls painted with floral motifs, their floors paved in mosaic. The city prospered through the 2nd and 3rd centuries, surviving the upheavals that shook the empire. Earthquakes damaged but never destroyed it. The purple workshops still operated, diminished perhaps, but the stench of murex processing still drifted from the southern shore where shell middens accumulated over Phoenician predecessors. The harbours still functioned, though silting from the causeway had narrowed the northern basin. By the 4th century, Christianity was transforming the temples, and a great basilica rose where older sanctuaries had stood. The colonnades still marched through the city centre, but now their shadows fell on a population that no longer remembered Melkart's name, only the Greek hero Heracles, who was himself fading before the cross. The cross conquered what siege engines never could. By the early 5th century, Tyre's ancient temples had fallen silent or been repurposed, their columns incorporated into Christian basilicas, their carved capitals crowned with incised crosses. The great cathedral that rose in the city centre was no modest house church. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in his church history, described the Tyrian cathedral dedicated around 313 of the Common Era as a marvel of engineering and devotion, with a vast atrium, fountains for ritual purification, a timber-roofed nave of extraordinary height, and thrones for the clergy arranged in ascending tiers. This was a city that embraced its new faith with the same architectural ambition it had once lavished on Melkart. Through the 5th century, Byzantine Tyre remained a prosperous port. The colonnaded streets still functioned as commercial arteries. Workshops produced glass, textiles, and still purple dye, now reserved for imperial vestments shipped to Constantinople. The population had contracted from its Roman peak, but the city retained its bishopric, its harbour trade, and its strategic value on the coastal road linking Antioch to Egypt. Then the earth moved. In 502, A severe earthquake damaged structures across the city. Repairs had barely finished when, in 551, a catastrophic tremor, part of the devastating Beirut earthquake sequence, struck the Lebanese coast. Entire colonnades collapsed. The hippodrome, already falling into disuse, suffered structural failure. A tsunami followed, sweeping into the harbour basins. Byzantine imperial funds assisted reconstruction, but the city that emerged was smaller, its monumental fabric patched rather than renewed. Reused Roman columns appeared in hastily rebuilt churches. Mosaic floors from this period show cruder workmanship than their predecessors. Beautiful still, with geometric patterns and cross motifs, but lacking the mythological exuberance of the pagan centuries. The Persian-Sasanian invasion of 614 brought fire. Khosrow II's armies swept down the Levantine coast, sacking Jerusalem and carrying off the True Cross. Tyre fell to the same campaign. Churches burned. The population suffered massacre and deportation. Byzantine authority returned briefly after Heraclius's victories in the 620s, but the city had barely drawn breath before a new force appeared from the south. In 636, Muslim armies arrived. Tyre, weakened by decades of war and earthquake, submitted without prolonged resistance. The transition was less catastrophic than the Persian sack. The new rulers maintained the port's commercial function, collected the jizya tax from the Christian population, and gradually established mosques alongside surviving churches. Arab geographers of the following centuries described Tyre as a fortified coastal city, its walls still formidable, its harbour still active in the trade between Egypt and Syria. Al-Muqaddasi, writing in the late 10th century, noted its strong defences and its role as a port of consequence. Under Fatimid rule from the late 10th century onward, Tyre's fortifications were maintained and strengthened. The city became a naval stronghold, its ancient walls, now layered with Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic repairs, still rising from the sea on three sides. The harbour, though silted and reduced from its Phoenician glory, sheltered warships and merchant vessels. Ceramic evidence from this period shows glazed wares, oil lamps with Arabic inscriptions, and trade connections reaching from North Africa to the Persian Gulf. The city endured, diminished but defiant, its identity layered like its own archaeology. Phoenician foundations beneath Roman columns, beneath Byzantine mosaics, beneath Islamic plasterwork. When Crusader armies first appeared along the coast in 1099, Tyre's garrison held firm. It would resist for another quarter-century, the last major port on the Levantine coast to remain beyond Frankish control, its ancient reputation for withstanding siege still echoing across the millennia from Shalmaneser and Nebuchadnezzar to this final medieval stand. The siege that finally broke Tyre's medieval defiance began in February of 1124, when King Baldwin II of Jerusalem coordinated a combined land and naval assault with a Venetian fleet of more than 100 vessels. The Venetians blockaded both harbours, the ancient northern and southern basins that had sheltered Phoenician galleys 2,000 years before, while Frankish forces pressed the landward approach along Alexander's causeway. For nearly 5 months the garrison held, but Venetian naval superiority strangled the city's supply lines. By July, Tyre surrendered on terms. The Venetians received 1/3 of the city, their own quarter with church, market, and bakehouse, privileges enshrined in the Pactum Warmundi. The last great coastal stronghold of the Fatimid Levant had fallen. The Crusaders inherited a city of extraordinary archaeological density and immediately built upon it. Frankish masons raised new walls atop foundations that descended through Islamic, Byzantine, Roman, and Phoenician layers. Limestone blocks quarried from Roman ruins were recut and fitted into Crusader curtain walls. The great Gothic cathedral rose near the peninsula's centre, its pointed arches and ribbed vaulting a startling northern European form planted on Mediterranean bedrock. Granite columns plundered from the Roman colonnaded street were incorporated into its nave. This cathedral became one of the most important churches in the Latin East. Within its walls, the kings of Jerusalem were crowned when the holy city itself was lost. In 1190, the body of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had drowned crossing the Salef River in Anatolia during the Third Crusade, was brought to Tyre for burial. His flesh was interred in the cathedral, his bones sent onward toward Jerusalem. The cathedral thus held the remains of a Holy Roman emperor, its stones absorbing yet another layer of the sacred and the imperial that Tyre had accumulated since the days of Melkart. 3 years earlier, in 1187, Saladin had swept through the Crusader states after his victory at Hattin. City after city fell. Yet Tyre held. Conrad of Montferrat, arriving by sea just as the garrison wavered, rallied the defence. He ordered the harbour chains raised and the landward gates sealed. Saladin besieged the city through the winter, but could not breach the walls or overcome the Frankish naval advantage in the harbours. By early 1188, he withdrew. Tyre became the nucleus from which the Third Crusade would rebuild Crusader power along the coast, the island fortress fulfilling once more its ancient role as the place that siege could not reduce. For over a century and a half, Crusader Tyre thrived as a trading emporium. Venetian, Genoese, and Pisan merchants maintained separate quarters. Sugarcane was processed in nearby plantations. Glass workshops continued a craft tradition stretching back to Phoenician origins. The harbour, though silted and smaller than its ancient predecessor, remained the finest deep-water anchorage on this stretch of coast. The end came not by siege but by strategic demolition. In 1291, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil completed the conquest of the remaining Crusader strongholds. Acre fell in May after a devastating assault. Tyre's garrison, seeing the inevitable, evacuated by sea without a fight. The Mamluks entered an empty city and then systematically destroyed it. Walls were pulled down, towers toppled, harbour fortifications demolished stone by stone. The policy was deliberate: deny any future Crusader fleet a defensible port for reconquest. What Nebuchadnezzar and Alexander had failed to erase entirely, Mamluk engineers accomplished with methodical thoroughness. The destruction layer is visible in excavation, a horizon of tumbled ashlar, smashed Gothic tracery, burned timber, and collapsed vaulting lying atop centuries of Crusader occupation. Beneath this rubble, the Roman columns still stand in their trenches. Beneath those, Phoenician walls sleep undisturbed. The cathedral is gone, its exact footprint debated by archaeologists, Barbarossa's tomb lost somewhere in the fill. The city that had resisted every army from Assyria to Saladin was finally left open to the wind and the slow accumulation of sand, its harbours silting shut, its population scattered into the surrounding villages. The peninsula quiet for the first time in 3,000 years. For centuries after the Mamluk demolition, the peninsula lay quiet. Fishermen mended nets among fallen columns. Ottoman-era houses rose on foundations their builders never understood, and the ancient harbours filled with sediment until their outlines vanished beneath sand and shallow water. Tyre became a modest coastal town, its deep past suspected but untouched, the layers of 3 millennia compressing silently beneath gardens, streets, and cemeteries. The first systematic attempt to read those layers came in 1860, when the French scholar Ernest Renan arrived on the Lebanese coast with a small team of surveyors and draftsmen. His mission was broad, a survey of Phoenician antiquities across the entire littoral. But Tyre commanded particular attention. Renan mapped visible ruins, sketched column drums protruding from the soil, noted the geological signature of Alexander's causeway in the widened peninsula, and recorded the massive murex shell deposits south of the city that confirmed ancient literary accounts of the purple dye industry. His published results, appearing in 1864, gave the Western scholarly world its first measured encounter with the physical remains of Phoenician Tyre. Yet Renan also recognized the central frustration that would define every campaign to follow. The living city sat directly atop the ancient one, and the deepest strata, the Bronze Age and Iron Age levels that held the secrets of Hiram and Melkart and the great harbour, lay beneath inhabited ground, inaccessible to the spade. Nearly a century passed before large-scale excavation began. From the 1940s through the 1970s, Emir Maurice Chehab, of Lebanon's Directorate General of Antiquities, directed campaigns that transformed understanding of the site. At Al-Bas, southeast of the ancient island core, his teams uncovered the monumental Roman hippodrome, its spina still partially intact, its seating tiers emerging from centuries of accumulated earth. Nearby, the vast necropolis revealed hundreds of sarcophagi, marble and limestone, carved with garlands, mythological scenes, and portrait busts, dating from the 2nd through the 4th centuries of the Common Era. At Almina, on the peninsula itself, excavators cleared sections of the great colonnaded street, its granite columns rising again into Mediterranean light for the first time in over 1,000 years. A monumental archway, paving stones grooved by ancient cartwheels, and mosaic floors from Roman-era buildings emerged in sequence, each layer peeled back to reveal the one beneath. Underwater surveys added another dimension. Divers and marine archaeologists identified submerged wall lines extending from the northern and southern harbour basins, massive ashlar blocks cut in the Phoenician manner, their headers and stretchers still fitted with precision beneath the waves. These were the harbour walls that had sheltered Tyrian fleets, now resting 2 to 3 meters below the modern waterline, shifted by tectonic subsidence and centuries of coastal change. In 1984, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization inscribed Tyre as a World Heritage Site, recognizing both the significance of what had been found and the urgency of protecting what remained unexcavated. The designation covered the Al-Bas and Al-Mina archaeological zones, but the deeper challenge persisted unchanged since Renan's day. The Phoenician city, the temples, the palace quarter, the workshops where murex was crushed and bronze was cast, lies beneath a modern urban population of tens of thousands. Every foundation trench dug for a new building risks cutting through strata that no archaeologist has ever recorded. Salvage excavations occasionally glimpse fragments, a stretch of Iron Age wall here, a scatter of 7th century pottery there, tantalizing edges of a city that remains fundamentally buried. The stones that do stand exposed tell their own quiet story. Roman columns cast long shadows across excavation trenches. Sarcophagus lids lie where Chehab's workers carefully set them decades ago. The hippodrome's curved end faces the sea. And beneath all of it, below the Roman pavement, below the Hellenistic fill, below even the Crusader rubble, the Phoenician layers wait in darkness. The island that mastered the ancient sea, still holding its oldest secrets in silence beneath the streets of the city that inherited its name. What remains is not silence, it is transmission. Every letter on this screen descends from marks that Phoenician scribes carved into stone and scratched onto papyrus in the workshops of Tyre and its sister cities. The Aleph, the Beth, the Gimel, signs stripped of the pictographic weight of Egyptian hieroglyphs, reduced to pure sound, portable, teachable, democratic in their simplicity. Greek merchants trading in Levantine ports adopted these letters by the 9th century before the Common Era, rotating some, adding vowels, but preserving the essential architecture. From Greek came Latin. From Latin came the scripts of Western Europe. From the same Phoenician root grew Aramaic, and from Aramaic flowed Hebrew and Arabic. The alphabet is Tyre's most pervasive gift, so deeply absorbed into human civilization that its origin requires excavation to remember. Then there is the colonial web. Carthage, founded by Tyrian settlers in the late 9th century before the Common Era, grew into a power that challenged Rome itself for mastery of the Western Mediterranean. Gades anchored Atlantic trade. Leptis Magna became one of Roman Africa's grandest cities. Motia, Panormus, Sulcis, Nora, Phoenician foundations that became the urban skeleton of Sicily, Sardinia, and Iberia. Tyre did not merely trade with the Western Sea. It planted cities there, carrying with it temple plans, harbour engineering, metallurgical knowledge, and the alphabet itself. The concept of the maritime city-state, wealth built not on agricultural hinterland, but on ships, harbours, and the exchange of goods across vast distances, found its purest early expression on that rocky island off the Lebanese coast. Purple endures as symbol. The murex dye that stained Tyrian workers' hands for centuries became the colour of sovereignty across the ancient world. Roman senators wore purple borders. Byzantine emperors were born in the purple chamber. Cardinals wear it still. The connection between this colour and supreme authority traces directly to the reeking vats of Phoenician dye works, where tens of thousands of crushed sea snails yielded pigment worth more than gold by weight. And the causeway remains. Satellite imagery shows the geometry clearly, the unnatural widening of land connecting what was once an island to the shore. Sediment accumulated over 23 centuries around the rubble core that Alexander's engineers piled into the sea. The island that resisted every siege for 1,000 years was defeated not by breaching its walls alone, but by eliminating the sea that protected them. The peninsula that exists today is itself an artifact, a monument to the single military operation that ended Tyre's island identity forever. Beneath the modern city, perhaps 60,000 people live atop layers that no systematic excavation has reached. The Iron Age temples, the Phoenician harbour installations, the residential quarters where 30,000 souls once crowded into multi-story buildings on 135 acres. All of it waits in compressed darkness below Ottoman foundations, below Crusader rubble, below Roman pavements. What has been uncovered represents a fraction of what the peninsula still holds. The Mediterranean laps at stones that Phoenician masons cut. The horizon line stretches westward toward Carthage, toward Gibraltar, toward all the places Tyrian keels once touched. The ruins at Golden Hour cast the same shadows they cast 3,000 years ago, though the hands that shaped them have been dust for 100 generations. The island that mastered the ancient sea gave the world its letters, its royal color, its model of the trading city, and a network of colonies that became nations. Its deepest story remains unfinished, locked in strata that future centuries may yet bring to light. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete story of Tyre. If these ancient stones have spoken to you, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next city we bring back from the silence of the deep past.